We've seen a few examples of local variables, variables that are created inside of a function that are only accessible inside that function. For example, in the my_mult, we had x and y, which did not exist outside of this function. We called our input something else outside the function. When they got passed to the function, they get a new name. So I might have like two things, I'll just call them my x's is 1 to 5 and my y's will be 5 to 9. That way they're the same size, and then I can call maybe result equals my_mult, and I'll put in my x's and my y's. But inside the function, these values are called something else. They're called lowercase x, lowercase y, and that's it. And the same with this a. So when I run this, I don't get an a, I don't get lowercase x, I don't get lowercase y. Those are all what are called local variables just inside the function. There's another type of function, another type of variable though. So let's talk about local and global variables. Global variables are accessible anywhere in the program. Usually this is a bad idea. Trust me. If you can use local instead, you should, and you can always use local instead, because remember, these values are getting passed from one place to another. So if you're in your main workspace and you want to send a value over there, you don't want to declare a global variable so that it's accessible from everywhere. Instead, you send the value very carefully, very precisely to the function workspace, where it takes it in and renames it and uses a local variable before it sends it back or does whatever it does. So global variables should be avoided, but I want to show you what they are. So let's create a new script. Create a new function file. I'm going to create a whole new file here with the following code, and I will copy and paste it back over here when I'm done. But for now, let's create a new one, and of course we have to have the word function. We need a word for the output, so I'll just use result for right now, and I'm going to find the distance of t. So this function calculates the distance an object falls. Let's say the distance a falling object travels due to gravity in time t, the input argument. Input in seconds. That's fine. So we need the gravitational constant in order to calculate this. Let's assume that we have it, and it's called g for a minute, and then we'll come back to what is g. But let's say, how would we do this? The distance traveled, which I want my output to be called result. Result is half of capital G times t squared. And I'm using the dot before the exponent just in case they pass in a whole array of values, one-dimensional or two-dimensional array. We will suppress that output and end. So notice that I'm relying on there to be a g. We could define a gravitational constant locally right here and say g is 9.8 or 32 if we're using feet per second, but 9.8 in meters. But I want to not do that. So that's the local way to do it. What I want to do is over here in our script, and like I said, I'll come back and paste in that code when we're done. Now use the function that we just created. What I want to do is say with a g. So I'm going to define g equals 9.8 right here. But notice I'm not passing it in when I say, just tell me what the distance is after 3 seconds. Here I've defined g. It's in my workspace out here. So if I run this section, let's see what happens. Run this section. The problem is g exists out here in my workspace, but in the distance it doesn't. So we can get around that. Although it's not usually a good idea to create a global variable, we could, if we wanted to, say, hey, by the way, we're creating a global G. Not just any G, a global G. And it is convention for the global variables to be named in all caps, or at least the first initial to be caps. But I like all caps, so maybe if we did like gravity, it really helps it to stand out to say, hey, this is something special, something different. And hey, I probably shouldn't do this. So global variables should be avoided. We definitely don't need one here, but we're using it just as an example. So now I've got this line that says global G, and then I've given it a value, and then even though it's in my outer workspace, it will be accessible inside the function. So that separation is gone. So let's clear all this. And see what happens when I run these three commands now that I have distance saved like that. And so I'm using this G even though it does not exist. I'm going to run this section and I get an error. So what's happening is this phrase global G does not help us out in the main workspace. What really needs it is this function. So if you see the error that we got, it still says undefined function or variable G in the distance function line 5. And when I go look, it's because we're using G and it doesn't know where to go get G. But I can tell it right here, hey, G is a global variable, so go out to the main workspace to look for its value. Now, if I need to erase it here, it doesn't help us there. But what this does is, okay, we have a G, and then when I call the distance function, it's going to know that there's a G out there to go look for. So let's clear all this one more time, and this time, hopefully, we don't get an error. I've got global here because it's the function that needs to know go somewhere else to find this variable. Go out in the big world. And that's where this function is defined. So I'm going to run this section. Again, that's just G equals 9.8 and then calling the distance function. And when I do that, I get a result this time because I've put the word global inside the function where it belongs. All right. All of this is just an example of how global variables might work. But as I mentioned, they should be avoided. You should not turn in any challenge problems with a global variable declared at them. All of your variables should be local. They should be passed using the input and output features of the function definition. And when you call the function, you send along the inputs you want to use, and then MATLAB will send back the output variables when it's done with the function. All right, so that was global and local variables. See you next time.